The Last Flight to Staten Island Part 1. The Last Ferry. The white and orange Staten Island ferry, the Andrew J. Barberi, sat like a placid, oversized bathtub toy in its slip at the Whitehall terminal. For Captain Elias Vance, it was a second home. A vessel whose every creak and groan was as familiar as the sound of his own breathing. For 23 years, he'd navigated the 5.2-mile route across the Upper Bay, a journey so routine he could perform it in his sleep. Today, the familiar view of the lower Manhattan skyline was wrong. Plumes of thick, black smoke rose from the financial district, staining the bright autumn sky. The usual cacophony of the city was underscored by a new dissonant chord. The wail of countless sirens, the distant, percussive thump of explosions, and a low, pervasive roar that was the sound of a city of 8 million people screaming at once. His first mate, a young, earnest man named Leo, rushed onto the bridge, his face pale. "Cap, the Coast Guard is on the horn. They're ordering all commercial vessels to assist with an unregulated evacuation. They're calling it Operation Safe Harbor." Elias didn't turn from the window, his hands gripping the cool metal of the console. "Safe Harbor," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. He'd heard the fragmented news reports on the radio before they died to static. Mass hysteria. Ungovernable crowds. The euphemisms did little to mask the truth. He'd seen the videos on his phone before the cell networks collapsed. People acting not like people, but like animals. Worse than animals. The order is to load to absolute maximum capacity and make for St. George Terminal. No protocol on numbers. Just get as many out as you can. Elias finally turned. His crew Leo, the chief engineer Maria, and 2 deckhands looked at him, their eyes wide with a fear they couldn't conceal. They were ferry workers, not naval infantry. Their biggest crisis was usually a drunk tourist or a mechanical failure in the middle of the bay. "You heard the man," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "Prepare for boarding. Secure the vehicle gate. We'll only use the pedestrian entrances. Maria, I need every bit of power you can squeeze from these engines. This is going to be one heavy girl." As they moved to their stations, Elias picked up the ship's intercom. The microphone felt heavy in his hand, an instrument that usually announced sightseeing trivia about the Statue of Liberty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the empty, cavernous passenger decks. "This is Captain Vance. We have been tasked with an emergency evacuation to Staten Island. We will be boarding immediately. I urge you to remain calm and orderly. Help your neighbors. Make room for everyone." He knew it was a futile plea. He'd seen the crowd gathering on the plaza outside the terminal, a seething, panicked mass of thousands pressed against the security fences. The NYPD perimeter was a thin blue line, buckling under the pressure. The moment the crew opened the access ramps, the dam broke. It wasn't a boarding. It was a flash flood of humanity. People poured onto the ferry, a tidal wave of terror. They spilled across the open lower deck, crammed into the enclosed seating areas, flooded the stairwells to the upper level. They were businessmen with ties askew, mothers clutching crying children, elderly couples clinging to each other, their faces masks of pure, undiluted panic. The air filled with the sounds of sobbing, shouting, and the frantic scuffling of thousands of feet. Elias watched from the bridge wing, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The Barberi was designed to carry 5,000 passengers. He estimated they had that many in the first 5 minutes. And still they kept coming, a relentless, desperate river. "Cap, we're at critical mass." Leo's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie, strained with effort. "The deck is listing portside. People are getting crushed down here." Elias looked down. The crowd on the dock was now a monster, a single organism driven by a mindless need to survive. The police line shattered. He saw officers being pulled under, their screams lost in the roar. And then he saw them. Among the panicked, fleeing citizens, there were others. Their movements were different, jerky, unnaturally strong, purposeful in their violence. They weren't trying to get on the boat. They were attacking the people who were. A man in a torn suit sank his teeth into the neck of a woman right at the edge of the gangway. She didn't even have time to scream before she was dragged down into the seething mass. The ferry groaned, a deep metal-on-metal protest. They were dangerously overloaded. The waterline was inches from the main deck scuppers. One big wave, one shift in weight, and they would capsize right at the dock, drowning everyone on board. "Leo!" Elias barked into the radio. "Retract the gangway, now!" "Captain, there are still hundreds." "Retract it! That's an order!" He heard the hydraulic whine, then a series of sickening crunches and screams as the metal ramp lifted, severing the last connection to the dock. Dozens of people who were halfway across fell into the foul, churning water between the ferry and the pilings. Others, still on the dock, beat their fists against the steel hull of the boat, their faces contorted in betrayed fury. They were the almost made-its, the not-quite-fast-enoughs. He had condemned them with a single command. His eyes met those of a young father holding a small girl, both trapped on the wrong side of the gap, their hope extinguished. The man's mouth formed a single silent word. "Why?" Elias turned away, his stomach churning. He strode back into the wheelhouse, slammed the engine telegraph to all ahead full, and gripped the helm. The great propellers churned the water, and the Andrew J. Barbary, laden with the living and dying, began to pull slowly, agonizingly, away from the hell of Manhattan. Behind them, the terminal was a slaughterhouse, and the sounds of it followed them out into the bay. He had saved his ship. He had saved thousands. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled his soul, that the ghosts of those he left behind would never leave him. Part 2. The Weight of Water. The Barbary moved through the water like a wounded whale, sluggish and low. The normal 25-minute crossing would take twice as long. The bay, usually bustling with traffic, was a bizarrely serene graveyard. A few other vessels, a tourist cruiser, a private yacht were also making their escape, but most moved erratically, some even colliding in the panic. The Coast Guard cutters they'd been promised were nowhere to be seen. From the bridge, the view was apocalyptic. The entirety of Lower Manhattan was on fire. The iconic skyline was now a jagged silhouette against a wall of flame and smoke. The air, even this far out, tasted of cinder and something else. Something sweet and foul, the smell of a city burning itself to death. But the true horror was on the boat itself. The initial crushing pressure of the crowd had eased, replaced by a tense, suffocating dread. The decks were a solid mass of humanity. People stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to move, to sit, to fall. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, vomit, and fear. Elias left Leo at the helm and descended to the main deck. He needed to see it for himself. He needed his crew to see him. As he pushed his way through the press of bodies, 100 hands reached for him, clutching at his uniform. "Captain, my husband, he was right behind me. We need water." "How long until we get there?" "My son, he can't breathe." He offered what reassurances he could, his voice a hoarse imitation of authority. He was a ferry captain, a manager of schedules and tourist groups. He was not equipped for this. He found Maria, the engineer, in a narrow passageway, trying to calm a group of people who were on the verge of hysteria. "The engines are at 110%, Cap," she whispered, her face slick with sweat and grime. "If we push any harder, we risk a burnout. We're stuck at this speed." As they spoke, a new sound cut through the low murmur of fear. A scream, sharp and piercing from the starboard side. Then another. A wave of movement, a ripple of panic passed through the crowd. "They're on board!" someone shrieked. "They're here!" Elias's blood ran cold. He fought his way toward the commotion. On the open deck, A circle had formed around a scene of brutal violence. One of the infected A-women in a blood-stained nurse's scrubs had a man pinned against a lifeboat davit, her teeth buried in his shoulder. The people around her were screaming, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The press of the crowd was so great that they couldn't even flee. "Stand back!" Elias roared, drawing the heavy signal flashlight from his belt. He was a large man, and his voice carried. The crowd parted just enough for him to lunge forward. He didn't think. He swung the metal flashlight like a club, bringing it down on the back of the nurse's head. There was a sickening crack. She went limp and slid to the deck. The man she'd been attacking slumped down, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with terror and pain. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the man's whimpers and the thrum of the engines. All eyes were on Elias and the two bodies at his feet. He had just killed a woman. A sick woman, a victim herself. But on this ship, there was no room for victims. There was only the binary of safe and threat. "Listen to me," Elias shouted, his voice raw. "Anyone who is bitten or showing signs of sickness, you must identify yourselves. For the safety of everyone on this vessel, we have a medic. We can isolate you." A deadly hush followed his words. It was a death sentence. To step forward was to be marked, to be thrown overboard or locked in a storage closet. No one moved. But Elias saw the furtive glances, the people subtly checking their arms and legs, the mothers pulling their children closer, inspecting them for any scratch. He had introduced a new virus onto the ship: suspicion. The fragile community of survivors shattered in an instant. People no longer saw their fellow refugees. They saw potential carriers, threats hiding in plain sight. He ordered the bitten man to be taken to a locked equipment room, his pleas for mercy echoing down the passageway. The body of the nurse was unceremoniously rolled over the railing into the dark water of the bay. There were no rights, no words. It was a disposal. As he made his way back to the bridge, the weight of the decisions he had made felt physical. He had left hundreds to die. He had killed a woman. He had turned his ship into a floating prison of fear. He looked out at the Statue of Liberty, her torch seeming to mock them as they passed. She was a symbol of refuge for the huddled masses, but for the masses huddled on his ship, there was no refuge. Only a slow, creeping realization that the infection wasn't just a sickness of the body, but one of the soul. They were carrying it with them. The real quarantine hadn't begun on Staten Island. It had begun the moment he pulled away from the dock. Part 3. A Different Shore. The St. George terminal grew from a speck on the horizon into a concrete monolith. But something was wrong. There were no welcoming parties, no lines of buses, no organized military presence. The terminal was dark, its windows gaping, empty holes. The ferry slips were empty. The entire waterfront seemed deserted. "No sign of life, Cap," Leo said, his binoculars pressed to his face. "No lights, no movement. It's a ghost town." A fresh wave of panic began to ripple through the passengers as they saw their promised sanctuary was just another ruin. The cries and questions started up again, louder, more desperate. Elias's mind raced. He couldn't dock at the main slip. If that crowd rushed onto an unstable shore, it would be a massacre. He needed a plan, a sliver of control. He picked up the intercom again. The speakers crackled, and the entire ship fell into an anxious silence, hanging on his every word. "This is the captain. We are approaching St. George. The situation on shore is unknown. For your safety, we will not be docking at the main terminal. I am taking us to the emergency maintenance pier further south. When we dock, you will disembark in an orderly fashion. Help will be waiting there. I repeat, remain calm and orderly." It was a lie. There was no help. But a lie was better than a riot. He navigated the heavy ferry away from the main terminal, guiding it towards a smaller industrial pier used for Coast Guard vessels and maintenance barges. It was quieter here, more controllable. As the ship nudged against the pilings, his crew, brave, exhausted men and women, managed to secure the lines. They lowered a single narrow gangway. The moment it was down, the human dam threatened to break again. "Stop!" Elias's voice boomed from the bridge wing, amplified by a bullhorn. Everyone froze. He pointed to the front of the crowd. You with the child, you first. Then you, help that elderly woman, slowly, one row at a time. Anyone who rushes will be left behind." It was an illusion of order, a desperate pantomime of civilization, but it worked. The disembarkation began, slow, tense, but controlled. People streamed off the boat, their eyes wide with a mixture of relief and new fear as they set foot on the unknown territory of Staten Island. Elias watched them go. 5,000 souls, maybe more. He had done it. He had gotten them across. But as he looked at their faces, haunted, shell-shocked, many now looking at him not with gratitude but with a kind of weary resentment, he felt no pride, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He saw the young father he'd left behind in every child's face. He saw the nurse he'd killed in every woman's eyes. He had traded their lives for these. It was a calculus of survival that felt utterly inhuman. When the last passenger had stumbled onto the pier, Elias stood on the empty, trash-strewn deck. The silence was deafening. His crew gathered around him, their faces hollow. "What now, Cap?" Leo asked quietly. Elias looked back across the water. Manhattan was a funeral pyre, a warning. He looked at the dark, silent streets of St. George leading up the hill. That was the future, uncertain, dangerous, and utterly foreign. "Now," Elias said, his voice a dry rasp, "we go ashore." He was the last to leave the Andrew J. Barberry. He walked down the gangway, his footsteps echoing on the weathered wood of the pier. He didn't look back. The ship had been his life, his command, his responsibility. Now it was just a hollowed-out shell, a relic of a world that was gone. He stood on the pier as the sun began to set, casting a bloody glow over the bay. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man, one of thousands, stranded on a different shore. He had saved them from the fire, only to deliver them into the unknown. The weight of the lives he had saved was immense, but it was the ghostly weight of the lives he had condemned that threatened to pull him under. The last ferry had reached its destination, but the journey, he knew, was only just beginning.